One of my favourite book series of all time is George R.R. Martin's A Game of Thrones. I have reread this first book at least 4 times and the rest of the series twice, with having copies in physical, audio, and digital format. It's fair to say I'm obsessed, and obviously we are waiting for the series to be concluded by Mr. Martin. Please get to it. But yeah, in the meantime, we need to find some other books. And today's video is about some recommendations from me on other books you can read while we're waiting. These books vary in terms of length of series, but they have common themes with the Game of Thrones, and I'm going to be going through with each of these why. So then if there is a particular reading trope or element you really enjoy, then you may want to pick one of these series up if you haven't already. Let's take a look at what those are. The first series I'm recommending, and I will be entirely honest, I'm recommending this based on the first book only, is The Poppy War by R.F.Kuang. Now, this book has a reasonable amount in common with A Game of Thrones, although the settings are very different. Now, the events of A Game of Thrones are often historically tied to what's known as the War of the Roses here in the UK. So it has some historical links. And the same is true of the Poppy War. What is perhaps devastating to know is that the events in this fantasy series are somewhat inspired by events that took place during World War II. Now, if you know what happens in this first book, and I have to caveat, I don't know what happens in book 2 or 3 yet because it is still on my reading list, but even just knowing the first events of this book and that they are somewhat inspired by history is shocking and devastating because this is a brutal story. We also have a lot of racism and classism that comes into play with the Poppy War. The main character, Rin, is very much made to feel like she doesn't belong when she ends up passing a very prestigious test to enter this military school. She is from a social caste where she is deemed as a lower class citizen, and she is frequently pulled up and bullied because of it. Now, sort of society and class and common folk and nobility is somewhat of an element of the storyline in each of these books. So if you enjoy this kind of friction that comes from classism and society hierarchy as a whole, then The Poppy War is perfect for you. What also brings these two books together is that they both have their own elements of magic. Now, these are quite different, but they are both very destructive and have kind of negative consequences in a way for the societies they are in. So if you enjoy your fantasy books with magic in, then The Poppy War will tick that box for you as well. If there's one thing A Game of Thrones is known for, it's its broad scope and significant kind of world building that brings this whole kind of world together of both Westeros and Essos, and how the history of the people there has come to shape the world we start out with in A Game of Thrones itself. And the same is somewhat true for the Poppy War. There is an extensive history that's laid out in the narrative that's hinted at and dropped in throughout the narrative of the present day events, but it's no less detailed or rich. And the consequences of these events very much have their kind of, they're made to be known in the modern day. It's not just something that's happened to give context, but without meaning, so to speak. It very much feels like it's a relevant part of history, and it's not just something that's been dumped in the background just to make it look like something more cohesively put together, like it makes sense. I hope that makes sense. I hope I make sense, because I'm not sure I do at this point. So yeah, if you want to pick up a dark fantasy trilogy, because you enjoy Game of Thrones, then The Poppy War is a series I would direct you to. Moving on to another trilogy, for those of you who prefer your series on the shorter side, I next have a grimdark fantasy series that I've actually already read twice. And it's because I loved it so much the first time that I went back to it again, and I have no regrets. That series starts with Blackwing by Ed McDonald. Now, as I said, this is a grimdark kind of fantasy story, so it's set in a world where there is a lot of bad things going on. So we have history that plays in again to the kind of modern day narrative, but isn't maybe not quite so heavy as the likes of the Poppy War. So if dense world building is maybe a little bit much for you, I would say Blackwing is probably a slightly better recommendation, and that is not quite so heavy, but that doesn't mean it's any less impactful or meaningful. What I also especially enjoy about Blackwing is the protagonist character, Ryalt. He is far from your traditional hero character. He struggles with addiction. He is quite cynical, selfish. He has struggled with kind of his life, and he is not a particularly nice person, if we're being entirely honest. Now, I have read the entirety of this series, so I can talk about it as a whole, and we do get to see some kind of character growth from Ryalt throughout the books. I'm obviously not going to spoil anything for you, but it doesn't really ultimately change his motives or, where he starts at the beginning of the series. He is not a particularly nice person. He does things for reasons that are far from altruistic. So if that's your vibe, then Blackwing is certainly going to suit you. The magic in Blackwing is a little bit more overt than the Poppy War. So whereas that is a military fantasy with all these things going on and a little bit of magic, I would say Blackwing is kind of the opposite, and that it is very magic heavy. There's also maybe an element of developing tech, so I wouldn't say quite steampunk, but there is an element of like progression and rebuilding and that sort of thing. So maybe that's probably a little bit more westernized, whereas the Poppy War is kind of Eastern inspired. So there are some differences there. They both have their commonalities and also have commonalities with the Game of Thrones. But we've maybe got one Eastern setting and one Western setting. Blackwing is very much a more traditional Western style book, and it also has an element of romance, if that's your cup of tea. I also really enjoy how the history of events that have taken place to date and the magic that have occurred, they have a negative kind of corrupting aspect to the narrative, and the storyline ends up taking us down that route and really digging into this into a fun way. So I really enjoyed exploring this side of the book. So magic lovers, this one is for you. Finally, if you are a more adventurous reader or you love yourself a big series, then my final recommendation is going to be right up your alley, because There Be Dragons. If you enjoy narratives with dragons and other kind of mystical figures, then Robin Hobb's The Realm of the Elderlings series is going to be more for you. Now, what I really like about this series is that it isn't just set in one isolated setting. Rather, where we are to date, the first trilogy sets out the life of a character called Fitzchivalry Farseer, who is a bastard of a noble-born, who abdicates his position on the discovery of Fitzchivalry's birth, and instead he ends up growing up with the nobility but very much not part of it. So he ends up in this weird hybrid role where he is useful for the royal family to have handy, but he is far from an influential character in terms of ranking, but he ends up taking the role of the royal assassin. So we have intrigue, we have drama, we have death, we have dragons, and we have magic. So if this doesn't sound like Game of Thrones to you, then I don't know what will. As of recording, I am 7 books into this 16-book series saga. It's quite dramatic already so far, so insert your word of choice here if you have already read this series. I am really enjoying this one, and I'm also really enjoying the I suppose the idea of different magics being treated differently. So there are characters who are looked up to for their abilities with magic, going down a certain route. But there are also characters with a form of magic called the wit, which involves being able to commune with animals. And that is very much frowned upon, and to the point where people who can are like actively hunted. And unfortunately for Fitzchivalry, he is one of these people. Now, it is very much kept secret, but it is a big part of the narrative. And if you have read book 7, which is the last book I read, then maybe you'll understand why I've taken about a year's break, because the events of those books were hard and emotional and very charged. So I'm looking forward to going back to this series, but I have enjoyed that break to kind of process what's happened so far. It's a big series and it's a detailed series, and whilst I've only touched really on one character so far, we also go to a completely different kind of continent and storyline, I want to say, for the second trilogy, which is the Rainwild Traders series. So the magic there is very different, but ultimately you can kind of tie it back at the end to how things have come about. But it's almost like a separate series within the series. And I'm hoping it will come together or somewhat overlap maybe a little bit later in the books. But either way, it's a fantastic storyline. It's not one I got into straight away, but I came to love those books at the end of that trilogy before we ended up going back to Fitzchivalry. So it's a big one. Arguably, I would say it's a bigger one than a Game of Thrones. So if you do like your depth and detail and chunky books and magic everywhere, dragons, wolves, all that good stuff, then Realm of the Elderlings, please pick it up. My friend Rachel recommended this series to me years and years and years ago, and I was like, yeah, I'll pick it up. Yeah, I'll get to it. I've got the first book. I've had a bit of a look, and and then I eventually read it, and I'm like, why did you not read it sooner? So if there is any series you take away out of this video today, Realm of the Elderlings, please go and read it. You won't regret it. So if you're looking for your next Game of Thrones fix, then I hope some of the recommendations in today's video have given you some inspiration of what to read next. Have you read any of the books I've mentioned in today's video? Do you have an alternate recommendation for a Game of Thrones substitute or other series with its similarities that you would like to recommend to other readers? If so, drop a note in the comments, and don't forget to follow me on social media. My tags for each social media account are listed in the description below, and of course don't forget to subscribe to find out what else I recommend, including book reviews, but also regular updates on what I'm reading, challenges I'm taking part in, and all that good stuff. Earlier this week, I shared my thoughts on Notes on a Nervous Planet by Matt Haig. So if you have a varied reading style like me and you like to pick up nonfiction as well, that could be a video you could go and look at next. Thanks for watching, and until next time, have a fabulous week. Bye for now.